A very good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Singapore International Cyber Week 2022. This session is called Raising the Bar, Building Consensus for Consumer IoT Device Security. I would also like to take this opportunity to say a very big hello to all of our virtual audiences from all over the world. My name is Juliana Yao, and it is my privilege to be your host for today. So, this particular session aims to help manufacturers of connected consumer IoT devices adopt critical capabilities to improve security in their products. An expert panel featuring industry representatives, subject matter experts, and government regulators will discuss the importance of critical security capabilities, also to share insight and guidance to support adoption and implementation by manufacturers to raise the baseline security of consumer IoT devices. In our panel session later, we will be using Slido for the question and answer segment, and we'll love for our audience to participate as well. So for those of you who are holding on to a smartphone, please do scan the QR codes located on the screens to input your questions for our panel of speakers. And for now, it does give me great pleasure to invite our moderator for this session. We have Ms. Charmaine Ng, Director of Asia Pacific Digital Policy at Schneider Electric. I would also like to introduce to you our panelists for today, Mr. Henry Tan, Deputy Director for the Cybersecurity Engineering Center, Mr. Richard Koh, Chief Technology and Security and Customer Success Officer at Microsoft Group, and finally, Mr. Doug Kramer, Secretary and General Counsel at Cloudflare Inc. And now that we do have all of our panelists and moderator on stage, Ms. Ng, take it away.
Thank you very much, Juliana. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this panel on raising the bar, building consensus on consumer IoT device security. My name is Charmaine Ng, and I am the Director for Asia Pacific Digital Policy at Schneider Electric. And I am delighted to be your moderator for this session. This session will aim to help manufacturers of consumer IoT products adopt critical capabilities to increase the levels of cybersecurity in their connected products. But before I begin, I wanted to share with you a brief history on IoT. IoT, has been around for at least 4 decades. It first appeared in the 80s, really, when some college students decided that they would fix a sensor onto the back of a Coca-Cola vending machine so that they could remotely track whether the machine had any cold soda. Super clever, but it wasn't called the IoT yet. Only until the dot-com era, when someone else decided to fix another sensor, this time an RFID chip, onto products which he was trying to track through the supply chain. And because it was the dot-com era, he decided to use the word Internet of Things to track the things that he was, tracking on the supply chain. And that's when it became the Internet of Things. So really, in its simplest form, IoT is a device with a sensor that collects and transmits data over the Internet. At a slightly more sophisticated level, it runs that data through an analytics program to generate some sort of insight. And at an even more sophisticated level, it's responsive. So ladies and gentlemen, today on this panel, you will hear from experts from industry and government agencies discuss about how we can collectively raise the bar on cybersecurity for these connected products over the internet. Now I will turn the time over to my panelists to introduce themselves to you and tell you about the initiatives that their respective organizations have in this regard. Perhaps we'll start with Henry.
Right, thank you, Charmaine, for the introduction. So I'm Henry, Deputy Director for Cybersecurity Engineering Center, Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. It brings me great pleasure to be here alongside my fellow panelists to discuss on this important topic on IoT security. And it was also quite an insight to know that IoT exists 40 years ago, And it is amazing that we have not acted till lately. So I think
Indeed.
this is the time that we really need to discuss on how we can protect IoT. So for us at Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, we have launched the Cybersecurity Labeling Scheme, or in short, CLS, since October 2020. It has been a great 2-year journey for us, and we are excited to share our experience on how we have approached this journey, and also interesting development during this week itself at the SICW. So I'm happy to share that and have a lot more conversation on this topic. And perhaps pass to Doug.
Very good. So I'm Doug Kramer, the General Counsel at Cloudflare. I'm very happy to be here. For those of you that don't know, Cloudflare runs a global network that is aimed at improving the security, reliability, and privacy of the internet. Our company motto is to help build a better internet. And so I think I'm very happy to be here today because, the Internet of Things we always approach from the security point of view as some sort of risk and insidious thing, right? But in a lot of ways, these devices we're talking about make life better for a lot of people and in some ways more efficient, give them the ability to do things and see things that they wouldn't have done before. But it comes with a lot of risk, right? So part of what we look at is how are we able to unlock the potential of the internet for people across the economic sectors and functional sectors and all of that, but to do so in a way that doesn't invite the sort of risk that sometimes can come with internet scale. So we have a little bit different approach to this issue because of the nature of our company. We don't necessarily produce retail devices or hardware that have the IoT devices themselves, but because we help operate the network, we want to make sure that we're part of an effective and secure, handshake that happens between the devices. And, part of the effort will be doing everything we can to make sure that the devices themselves are secure. But to the extent that that may not always be a perfect solution, we want to make sure that the network itself is doing what it can to identify problems that may be happening with IoT devices. And so today, hopefully I can add a little bit of that perspective of what that looks like sort of beyond the device, or when the device, especially corrupted devices, get onto the network, what resources we have at that point. So.
Hi, my name is Richard Koh. I'm the CTO here at Microsoft Singapore. So first of all, a big shout out and thank you to SICW for having Microsoft here, and really glad to be on this esteemed panelists here to talk about this particularly important subject. Charmaine, you brought up the great history about how college students were hacking the internet and monitoring soda machines. I thought that was really interesting because as the technology has really developed, I think from Microsoft's perspective, when we think about our mission to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more, just think about the number of devices on the planet today. I think by what we estimate by 2025, there's going to be like 42 billion devices that is going to be there. Surely, I think when we think about it, it surely makes our lives a lot easier in many different facets of it, especially with the way consumer behaviors have kind of changed during the COVID pandemic itself. So, but what I'd like to share a little bit about is also an effort that the industry, as we talked about how the industries as well as multi-stakeholders across governments and regulators are coming together, I want to share a little bit about what we're doing collectively as an industry when we think about consumer IoT security itself. And if I may have the slides to come on screen, and like to introduce the Cybersecurity Tech Accord. It's something that we have done across the industry for a number of years right now. And when we think about how we are empowering, let's say, for example, device manufacturers really to have a resource to think about how they would manufacture their products and across some form of a consensus in terms of standards and best practices itself. It's really at this forum that we're launching a subsection of the website itself, where this is a coalition of like-minded companies and together coordinated by the World Economic Forum as well as consumer internationals and also a security researchers group like I Am The Cavalry, really bringing together these kind of principles when we think about consumer IoT devices. And it's great that this is something that when we think about how different device manufacturers can really think deeper about when they're building their consumer devices, what are the kind of principles and practices that they should bring into the devices itself, because it really impacts a lot of people on the planet. So I think as tech companies, as device manufacturers, we all see that we all have a responsibility in this. And doing this is part of the contributions of whether it's tech companies like ourselves, Cloudflare, together with our government regulators, also providing them a venue where they can provide their inputs to the industry on how we think about some of these security standards as well. So New Resource Hub, it's a great venue for us to launch this. Certainly encourage everybody to take a look at this, especially if you're device manufacturers in this space. And it's well over 150 companies on the planet that's coming together to do this. And yeah, please get involved. I think as more and more companies come together to have this conversation, have these interactions, I think it will be a very productive one for every one of us. So thank you for the opportunity here today.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Richard, Doug, and Henry for the introductions. Perhaps I will start by asking Henry a question that I think a lot of people have on their minds with the CSA cybersecurity labeling scheme. How do you think industry has responded thus far to the CLS scheme for consumer IoT in Singapore?
Right, so thank you for the question. In a way, glad that we have manufacturers support so far. We launched the scheme around 2 years. And over the 2 years, we have now about more than 200 labeled products. So that in ourselves is quite honor for, I think we are quite pleased, at least for having this result at this point in time. And in fact, I think today on site with us in person, we have several of our manufacturers who have came to show support and to have the showcase of their devices. So that is something we are quite happy at this moment. We think that there's always more to do. IoT is a huge industry. There are, as Richard mentioned, it's going to be billions and billions of devices. Today, 200 labeled devices may not exactly change the needle yet, but I think that's certainly a good step, and we are glad again to have this manufacturer support. Alongside with some of this arrangement, which I can share a little bit more, that will probably also incentivize more manufacturers to see the value of using cybersecurity as a differentiator for the product to compete with our competitors.
Henry, you mentioned incentivize companies to get on board. Perhaps I'll pose the question to the rest of the panel and maybe even you. What kind of resources and or support do you think is needed to get more companies on board with cybersecurity labeling schemes like the one in Singapore and even the one that the White House has just mentioned last week, same cybersecurity labeling? What kind of resources and or support do you think is going to be helpful?
Mm-hmm. So I think what the Tech Accord has done now is something that is very encouraging. So I think many manufacturers, unlike in the traditional ICT world, which is a little bit more mature, many of these IoT devices might be produced by smaller companies, by startups, who may not necessarily have the capability or the resources to invest in cybersecurity. So just to share some examples, so when we first launched the scheme and we have applications coming in, well, when we designed the scheme, we kind of envisioned that, well, it's quite straightforward requirements, which probably shouldn't take too long in reviewing this application. But it turns out that many manufacturers at that point in time do take more than 6 months in order to kind of implement something which we think were quite straightforward. So I think that's a gap that we needed to address. But at the same time, once that these manufacturers has got their first product labeled, the subsequent rounds were so much smoother when they know that what are the requirements, what are the measures that's best practices to be implemented. So that's something that we are encouraged. So the resources will also further guide these manufacturers on how they could better implement some of these measures. And at the same time, I think we are trying to step out to engage manufacturers, telling them how they could do it, or in a way, what they could benefit from doing that.
Any comments from Richard or Doug?
I can jump in. Yeah. Well, it's a great question when we think about from a motivation standpoint itself. I think What does it mean? The kind of resources and support. I think for the most part, besides, let's say, for example, setting up the Cybersecurity Tech Accord itself, I think a big part of it is really changing the way companies think about such labeling schemes itself, because that can in itself become a differentiator. A differentiator when there is more confidence and assurance of your product itself, and not have the mindset of thinking that this is a burden, right? So I think it starts with having a growth mindset about thinking what this effort does to the company's products and services. And in many ways, that then helps to marshal the kind of resources that says, hey, this is the right thing to do. This is the right kind of conversations that we need to have with across the supply chain of device manufacturers, software developers, engineers, all of that. And being able to engage across regulators around the world so that there's some harmonization as well, just like what the different countries are doing today. And with that kind of a mindset, then it really changes the way the lens you put on it and say, hey, this is something that really could differentiate us if we think about doing something like this for our products.
Yeah, interesting, because it's always going to be a learning journey, won't it? Whether it's for the CSA in terms of how you design the application, a learning journey for manufacturers as to how to get certified, why should I get certified, and a learning journey for consumers really as to what does this label mean, what does that label mean, what does 3 stars mean, what does 4 stars mean. It's always going to be a learning journey, and we really need to engage each other more to understand really what is the underlying issue that we're trying to solve together. Now, a very important part of a successful cybersecurity labeling scheme is mutual recognition of cybersecurity labels across different jurisdictions, because it is very confusing for consumers when you have different labels for different products, different labels in different countries, and it's also very difficult for manufacturers when they have to comply with all these different requirements across the globe, and it becomes a very high technical barrier of entry. So it's really, really heartening to see that Singapore and Finland have a mutual recognition agreement for our respective cybersecurity labeling, and also just before this panel, actually, Singapore and Germany had signed an MOU to recognize mutually each other's labels. So Henry, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how did Singapore and Finland, Singapore and Germany come to this agreement, and are we looking to expand this to include more and more jurisdictions in the near future?
Okay, so as per this year's SICW team, digital security, a shared responsibility. So I think this is where the spirit of collectivity comes into play. So we do recognize that it is something that it cannot be solved by Singapore alone. It's a huge market. It requires collaborative effort to deal with it collectively. So the most common feedback that we often get from manufacturers are fragmentation of standards. When you go to different jurisdictions, you get different set of standards. They got to comply to different standards. And the other issues or feedback that we have gotten, the most common is about duplicating of tests. So it's got to come to Singapore, do one type of test, and go to, say, Europe, and go to redo the same set of tests, even though the requirements could be similar. Yes. So that increase the cost of compliance also for the manufacturers. And sometimes with different standards, that again act as a trade barrier, as you mentioned. So Singapore and Finland, with the 2 nations that has introduced a scheme earlier in our journey, recognize that the need that we need to do this together. So with a common underlying requirements for IoT devices, that is where we kind of stand out and say, how can we do this together to improve, to incentivize, as I mentioned earlier, to allow manufacturers to gain market access, to facilitate their motivation to want to do this. So eventually we kind of agree on this mutual recognition arrangement with Finland. And likewise, as more partners or nations come on board with their respective schemes, we work actively with these partner and nations to see how we can better align and come up with mutual recognition to allow this facilitation of market access for product to enter one another's market, that further reduce the cost of compliance for these manufacturers. And as I mentioned, we are really glad that about an hour ago, we signed a mutual recognition arrangement with the BSI in Germany.
Yeah, we witnessed it right in the studio,
Yes,
actually.
that's right.
It was really, really special. Moving away for a moment from cybersecurity labeling, earlier this year, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord worked with the World Economic Forum, Consumers International, and I Am The Cavalry to develop a joint statement on top priorities for consumer IoT device security, which endorses the 5 capabilities which Richard mentioned earlier on in his introduction and which I will repeat. 1, no universal default passwords. 2, implement a vulnerability disclosure policy. 3, keep software updated. 4, secure communications. And 5, ensure that personal data is secure. Now, this joint statement, Richard, was then endorsed by over 100 different organizations globally, including the CSA. Tell us a little bit more about how did this coalition come together and why is it important?
Yeah, so great question, Charmaine. I think about what's important. It's a little bit about what Henry mentioned, Doug mentioned earlier on. Just the sheer amount of devices that are coming out online. It's just like as we talk about things right here at this very moment, how many more million devices just came online, and depending on the scale of it, I think the discussion earlier on Henry had with you around that mutual recognition. That kind of agreement in terms of standards, I think it's very useful when we think about how some of these devices are being manufactured, shipped around the world, and used by consumers all around the world itself. And when we think about how this space is developing, it's just moving at a very fast pace that sometimes policymakers, lawmakers are really racing to catch up, if you will. So we believe that this regulatory gap at times can sometimes, I would say unintentionally, right, permitting some of these manufacturers to ship products that has, barely their kind of security, if you will. So, and just to contextualize this a little bit, right, when there's no expectation that of compliance, like with international recognized standards such as the IEC 62443, I think while it's cheaper and faster to ship those devices out, I think with default credentials and not thinking about some of these principles that we talk about in the Tech Accord itself, then we're putting the world in a lot more danger, as some of the devices can be so-called brought into botnets and stuff like that, or people's personal data get compromised. So this is not a world that we want to go into, but really to come together to have the conversation, have the kind of standards and universally agreed upon baseline in terms of practices that we can put on these devices itself. So I think this is a very, very important thing that we can do as an industry together with governments and regulators all around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would like to underscore what you said about IEC 62443 as an internationally recognized standard, which many manufacturers like Schneider Electric complies with, and which we can all probably use as a baseline moving forward. And it, how you talk about how it's cheaper, faster, and easier for manufacturers to ship out products with barely their cybersecurity, as opposed to hiring very expensive cybersecurity experts who code in forced password changes, which implies that you had to start with a complex password to begin with. So 12 digits, alphanumeric, special characters, uppercase, lowercase, and all that, and reset it every 3 months, which in turn also inconveniences the customers, right? So on that point, I think it is really good to have heard about Cloudflare's new initiatives around zero trust for consumer IoT. Doug, can you tell us a little bit more, please, about how does this line up with international standards, regulations, and labels? How can we make sure that government's very well-intentioned efforts to increase cybersecurity doesn't unintentionally stifle innovation that could maybe even produce better security?
Right. I mean, I think where we come from, and this is a little bit of shift in approach, because as I said before, we don't really create IoT devices, but we interact with them all the time. And as a company focused on security, the idea of redundancy or having many levels of defense is important, right? And so we interact and we see a lot of threats coming from IoT devices. So even though we don't make the devices, we share in the concern around them. And so, you want to fight this battle on many fronts. And one of those is going to be the front line of making sure the device is as secure as it can be, does not lead to vulnerabilities, does not get corrupted, all of those sorts of things. But that's not the end of the line, right? There are other, trenches that you have behind that front line where you can protect. And so at Cloudflare, we've thought about taking really the model of zero trust, where we use largely with people and organizations, and have applied that to dealing with IoT devices. So the idea is, if you take the sort of messaging that is coming in, the packets that are coming in from IoT devices, and you analyze those in much the way you would in a zero trust environment to make sure that they are going where they're supposed to be going, behaving like they're supposed to behave, and you can put rule set around them. So in the circumstance where maybe the devices are not perfect, and best efforts of government and industry and everybody combined, that's probably an unattainable goal, you have this next layer on the network that is analyzing and looking for those threats, those risks, in a rule set that who's ever administering, that function that the IoT devices are operating in, to identify and then stop the threats at that level as well. And we thought that the zero trust model was a good one to run with because, IoT devices in some way are not unlike end users or employees or people, right? They are the entry point for the activity that's happening, And in some ways, it's an easier challenge than zero trust because I, as an employee of the company, might do any number of thousands of things with my cell phone. I might go look at email or get on some of our systems or God forbid, go to the internet, and who knows what I'm going to sort of look at there. And I have my own risks. I may be, fall susceptible to a phishing attack, right? And then I become, that sort of problem that IoT devices themselves run into. The difference is that the IoT device usually has a more narrow set of what they can do. They're only going to send messages to a handful of approved places. They're only going to do it for a limited number of purposes, whether they're talking about the Coke machine or an error on or a need for maintenance on an industrial device or something. And so if you're going to create a rule set around what is anticipated to come from an IoT device, that's an easier rule set to write than it is for human beings, right? And so when you think about introducing those communications into a zero trust environment to analyze them, we thought that there's promise in doing that. And so we're trying to take those tools at the network level, build them into the way that networks talk to IoT devices, and we think there's real promise there. In the same way, though, that you want to train your employees up front not to fall susceptible to phishing attacks or not to go outside, color outside the lines on the internet, that's what we need to do with sort of labeling efforts and improving IoT devices. The last part of your question there was, what can we do to make sure that we're doing this in a way that doesn't stifle innovation? And I think that's the way that this is progressing. I mean, I don't think there is a conceit in any of this that labeling is going to solve the problem or that labeling is the only solution here. And I think labeling in particular is a method of government intervention that is open to other influences. It's not, to comment on some of the questions before that were less relevant because we don't produce devices, governments could step in with certification regimes or penalty systems, really, trying to make this completely waterproof or putting a lot of risk and threat in there. But a labeling system really works in tandem with industry, trying to create incentives in the market, to make sure that consumers don't just gravitate to the lowest price because they realize that there's a cost that comes with that, and it provides the information to do that. And I think it's a more permissive way for government to behave that really creates cooperations with industry that leverages, not just consumers, but also insurers as well. I could see insurance companies saying, unless your IoT devices have met this standard, your premiums are going to go up. And sometimes, industry doesn't, always welcome, difficult conversations around insurance premiums, but it might be better than a government regime that's looking to penalize or certify. And so I think the labeling approach plays into, as your question was getting to, this sort of cooperative, multifaceted approach to IoT security that is something that I think we find has promise.
It's super fascinating, Doug. It's really interesting to see how different organizations in the industry are dealing with cybersecurity. At Schneider Electric, cybersecurity and data protection are integral to our core strategy. It is not just some operating expense, some law we have to comply with, but we really see it as a business risk. For us, it's a business risk that requires the highest levels of attention from top management to make sure that we convert something that could have been a very burdensome operating expense to a strategic differentiator. I think, Richard, you mentioned something like this earlier. A strategic differentiator that can guarantee us the loyalty of our customers, because we don't want to just sell fancy, shiny consumer IoT products to our customers. We want to sell them fancy and shiny consumer IoT products that they feel safe and they feel secure using in their own homes. So, but coming back to labeling, there will be a risk that with labeling, some consumers will simply assume, oh, CSA gave it 3 stars, CSA gave it 4 stars, so this product that I've just bought yesterday will be secure for its entire lifetime, be it 1 year, 5 years, or even maybe 10 years. Where do we draw the line, really? When does it stop becoming the responsibility of the manufacturer to ensure security in their products, and when does it start becoming the responsibility of the consumers to make sure that their own devices are secure? Where do you think we should draw the line?
Right. So I think it is important, and it is always in our messaging, that having a 4-star product doesn't mean that it's unhackable. It's able to resist common cyber attacks against common home devices. But with a determined attacker and so on, that's always an ability to compromise it. So the messaging is something that we have to be very clear. So I mean, just side story perhaps.
Yeah.
So in the past, that when we were designing the labeling scheme, we have this thought of having the 5th legendary star that is pretty much non-existent and unachievable, in order to give the consumer the perspective that it's only 4 out of 5 stars, is not the highest 5 stars. But eventually, we don't think that really works out. I think it's better to do proper communication, letting the consumer better understand what are the risks involved and what kind of product suits their need. So as my director always like to say, we let water find its level in that sense. So giving the ability with the label to let the consumer understand what kind of properties that they have, in order to better determine what kind of security that they are required to. So for example, you have IP cameras that's really pointing at your balcony or at your door. Probably you don't really need that high level of security in compared to an IP camera that's within your home, in your bedroom. And I think that's where a previous report saying that IP cameras in Singapore were hacked, and the footages sold to websites drew concern for the consumer as well, that this is something that they should pay attention to. And I think that's where we are trying our best to start transforming mindsets of the consumer. I think that's where it is important to educate the consumer, the part that they have to play as well, understanding what it means for them, what they need to act on. At the same time, on a little bit more on the technical aspect, that is where even right at level 1, we do require the manufacturers to have a vulnerability disclosure program. We know that it's never going to be totally secure. Somewhere down the road, device may have bugs, may have vulnerability, and it's important that manufacturers commit themselves having this open channel to allow vulnerability to be reported, and then take timely actions. So the next important criteria that we have is likewise in the Tech Accord, 5 basic principles about having timely update, and to have a specified period of time where the manufacturers is committed to support with security updates. So I think collectively with all this awareness for the consumer and also some of these technical aspects, we hope that we have something that we can leverage on. It may not be perfect, there's more work to do, and I think that's where we have to work collectively again as an industry, as a partnership to address this.
A very interesting point, something that I would want to come back, but not before asking if Doug and Richard have anything to supplement your own views on.
Yeah, sure. So I would say this is certainly an area where the adage that, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, really means a lot, right? I think it's obvious that the certification of a device and its cybersecurity worthiness against today's threats may be very different. I would say a year from now, but maybe even, a couple of months from now, right? But we have a lot of different options to address that. And I think that, as the threats evolve, I think you can also work to evolve the different systems. And it may be true that not every user is going to be good, or maybe in some cases even able to sort of put a patch on the device to sort of bring it up the way the manufacturer would want. But that's something that the manufacturer, should keep in mind. But there are also, and again, going back to the way that we think about this, there's certainly a number of different options at the network level that can be done. We have worked with some of our customers who have these sorts of devices to sort of identify whether or not the packets that are coming in from the device have the recent patch that they consider essential. And if it doesn't, there are things that can be done at the network level to do that. I think the biggest effort that we're seeing with some of our customers who are IoT device manufacturers right now too, is to push more of the compute level off of the device and onto the network. And so you actually almost make the IoT device a little bit simpler because it's going to be easier to change the interface you're running on the network. And so if you do see these changes and you have a certification for a pretty straightforward set of functions that are happening on the device, there's a good chance that's going to be a more durable sort of certification because the threats you want to deal with aren't really being handled by the device itself, but by the way that it is then doing its processing, maybe on the network or off the device. So these are things that are evolving. As the threats are evolving, I think the way that we see manufacturers evolving to deal with those needs are going to keep up. And I assume, the labeling regimes are certainly going to keep up with as well. We have options.
I'll maybe just try and go on a, let's say, slightly different way of answering that question. I think I come back to the, kind of to the motto of this conference itself, right? Digital security, a shared responsibility, and the responsibility doesn't stop at any point in time. I think it's just continuous in many ways. And, I always like to tell the story that as the CTO of Microsoft Singapore here, I am by default my family's IT support, like 24/7 on the weekends with my mom and during the weekdays with my kids. And each time when I go visit my mom, it's always a constant process of updating her phone and checking on her health fitness devices and whether that software is updated, all of that. It's fascinating. And then she'll make the comment like, oh, why is it so troublesome? Why do you have to update this all the time? And you tell the story of how software is being built and built by who, and how hackers can come, take advantages of vulnerabilities and stuff like that. And then with my kids, I don't know whether in the audience you guys have kids who are gamers. They love to buy these kind of strip lighting that they put around in their rooms, and they jazz it up so that when they play their computer games, it has this like mood lighting. Those are consumer IoT devices, and it's just amazing where you can get them online these days. And you're just wondering, oh, how secure it is, because they can tap onto the internet itself, and they can control the lights and all that. And I'm like, well, who am I letting into my network? So a lot of times I said, okay, guys, let's take a look at where you bought this and how you configure this, and let's make sure that this is how it works. And the way I say it, look, this thing is fun, but at the same time, with this power comes responsibility. You remember Spider-Man? Okay, good. Then that's how you learn. And I think just as a parent and a son, I just built this into my own personal kind of responsibility, if you will. And I think if we expand this, kind of to the wider ecosystem, just like what Henry and Doug were saying, whether is it the education of it and all of that, it will become a very much second nature to society at large. And whether we are working in, security companies or device manufacturers, it just becomes an instinct that we have to do this. So yeah, that's my little kind of take on that responsibility aspect of it.
Where we want to get society to, right? The point where it's not when you go and see your mom that you help her update her software. She knows how to update it herself as and when it's being pushed out. And your kids will know that the fancy stuff that they have in their rooms are potential points of entry for attacks, right? There's so many all around our houses, and someone I heard today say it's in our bedrooms, it's in our kitchens, it's really, really everywhere.
Well, and touching on that point, because I was thinking about this when Richard was saying is, I imagine most people at a conference like this have heard this many times over, but if you haven't, the way our folks would talk about it, when you think about a home, a couple of years ago, as the world passed, 2 billion, 3 billion, 4 billion cell phones, you're not too far to where everybody's going to have a cell phone. And you might have had back in the day, one desktop computer in your house. So the points of risk you had in a house really capped out in that world, almost a little bit more than the number of people, right? But now if you think about our homes and all these things are in there, there is almost a limitless order of magnitude change of the number of entry points and risks, which is why, again, it's probably something that folks who are at a conference like this have heard many times over. But I always appreciate hearing that one because it's a great way for people to really think about why this is an issue worth time and attention, rather than just something we start to gloss over because we keep hearing about Internet of Things and smart toasters or something. But it's a significant change in the sort of risk profile.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, in terms of history, right? It was in 2008 when connected devices surpassed the number of human beings in this world, and the World Economic Forum predicts that by 2025, it's just 3 years from now, we're going to have 41.6 billion connected devices. It's really mind-boggling. Let's perhaps touch on the point that Henry and Doug mentioned a few minutes ago about different types of consumer IoT products. Let's talk about how we should be looking at the security for different types of IoT differently. Of course, we can't be securing consumer IoT in the same way that we secure industrial IoT. And of course, the regulatory regime cannot be one and the same. It cannot be one size fits all because the security profile for consumer versus industrial is so very different. But if we stay within the realm of consumer IoT, even that's very complex. So for example, the security issues that you're thinking about your smart lighting would be very different from the security issues that you're thinking about on your smart speakers that have the capability to maybe listen in on your conversations at home. And some people have concerns about their data being stored on the cloud. For Schneider, we manage this risk by giving our consumers the option to purchase products that are connected only by Bluetooth. So if you're within close proximity, the device works and no data has to be stored on the cloud. If you're not in close proximity, it doesn't work because you have a concern about data being stored on the cloud and you don't want to store data on the cloud, so we don't do that, right? I'm wondering what your organizations are doing to help consumers mitigate risks in terms of different types of consumer IoTs in our own homes.
Right, so I can start on that. I think you rightly mentioned that for different categories of products, there may be different standards that's required, there may be different requirements. And on this note, I'm again happy to re-announce announcement earlier today that we have also introduced a cybersecurity labeling scheme specifically for medical devices, because we do recognize that medical devices is pretty much unlike your consumer IoT. You may get some certain inconvenience when your light bulb is not working that well, but I think the level of consideration and concern will be very much different when it comes to medical devices that is used for patient care.
Your pacemakers.
Yeah, and precisely, and that is why we have decided and to work with our health authorities, the Ministry of Health, Health Sciences Authority, IHIS, to introduce and worked on this medical scheme for labeling itself. Anyway, coming back to consumer IoT, we also recognize that certain devices may have certain properties, and it's not going to be always, again, one size fits all. We have common standards that we can rely upon for broadly for the consumer IoT. So we do reference the EN 33645. I think that's also quite widely adopted in many of the other jurisdictions. That provides a pretty much sound baseline for the generic IoT across the board. At the same time, as we implement our scheme, so our scheme has 4 levels. As you go higher, the level of requirements has also increased. And when it comes to level 4, that is where we do recognize that testing of these certain products may require different approach. So on that part, we do publish our minimum test specification for specific products. So for example, we do have a specific documents only for Wi-Fi routers, and we do have additional documents on the other verticals as well. So this is something that the ETSI is also working on to develop verticals that could be applicable to interpret the 303645 to be relevant.
Very interesting. Perhaps before I jump on your comments again, Doug, Richard, do you have anything to comment and supplement?
So a couple of things that I would just say, and they're touching on themes or issues I sort of discussed before. I mean, I think the first, we would look at the network level, putting in rule sets that sort of define very clearly what this device is supposed to do, and importantly, where that data is supposed to go and where there are permitted destinations for it to go. So if we're getting a packet, we're looking at the packet, now all of a sudden it's trying to send that data somewhere that's not authorized by the customer, that's a problem, and we can shut that down and analyze it that way. And the same, when I talk about moving compute off the device and into the cloud, or onto the network, if someone is trying to hijack that and take something useful and send it someplace else and violate in that way, if none of that is really becoming anything useful until it sort of happens on the network, that's another way, I think, to sort of put a line of defense in there so that it can't be anything of value sort of misappropriated or sent in a wrong direction. So those are some ways that companies can try to address those issues as far as we're concerned.
Yeah, I mean, this is great, and hearing about what Schneider Electric and Cloudflare is doing. I think these are all the different kind of design considerations as as the engineers and the developers are building the products itself. And I think from let's say Microsoft's perspective, it's very similar in many sense when we think about the product design aspect of it. And just aside to the Cybersecurity Tech Accord itself, I really like to make a plug for, let's say, the device manufacturers itself, because where on that website is really like getting some of that guidance and information, if you will, and that factors into the product designs for a lot of the device manufacturers out there. So there's a big resource hub, and we should be expecting it to get more updated as more learnings come along the way as we think about some of these 5 principles that Charmaine, you have brought up, right? Like no universal passwords, a coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy, all of that. And as we mature in this space, I'm sure that device manufacturers would be able to take advantage of the website to learn more and more of this, and how do they bring some of that consideration into their product designs.
Thank you very much. Very interesting comments. I will ask one last question before I turn the floor to the audience in the room and those joining us virtually to ask my fellow panelists questions that you are burning to ask them. My last question is, when it comes to setting standards as well as regulatory initiatives like labeling, what kinds of engagement between public, private, and industry-wide do you think is necessary? And are there agencies, are there organizations that you guys think are doing particularly well in this regard?
But if I may go ahead first,
Sure.
so I think that's something that we are actively working on. As I mentioned earlier, the fragmentation of standard is something that is of concerning issue
Yes.
to us, and there's a greater need to harmonize standards and also to allow mutual recognition. So on this front, we have also put up from Singapore a universal cybersecurity labeling framework to the ISO committee. So, and that is now being submitted as ISO 27404.
27404.
Yeah, so essentially it is a framework to allow greater harmonization and to integrate the various technical standards that's possible. So with a universal framework itself, nations who is looking at introducing a scheme can then take reference on how to benchmark against the framework. So it really doesn't matter whether a nation decide to implement a binary scheme, which is like you have it or don't, or on a multi-level. So this framework then allows guidance on the mapping, and that would then allows greater collective effort in terms of getting recognition and establishing recognition. So that's something that we strongly believe in, that eventually we should perhaps has a vision of one single label, fully worldwide recognized, based on a single common standards.
Then how does the 27444 certification then sit with the cybersecurity label that maybe the organization had previously, or some other organization has the old now CLS versus another manufacturer that has the 27444?
So that
How about the consumer's
2744
confusion?
pretty much sets out a framework.
Yeah.
So for example, the CLS is perhaps an example that could map to the framework in terms of having the multi-level. So perhaps Finland will have ability to, even though the labeling program is a binary label, but with the framework they could get mapped to, for example, approximately level 3 of the framework. And that will allow different nations to get reference from that framework to better understand how we are all mapped and aligned, and that then facilitate mutual recognition negotiation.
Well, then a lot of consumer awareness will need to be pushed out to society, because people will start being like, oh, I don't know, what does 3-star mean, what does 4-star mean, what does ISO 2744 mean?
Yep.
A lot of awareness needs to go out.
So consumer awareness, education is something that is very important. It's going to probably take many years to come by. So I think if you draw it, when we design the cybersecurity labeling scheme, we do take inspiration from the energy efficient label as well. I'm quite sure today, if you're going to buy a refrigerator, you will subconsciously look at that label, whether it has 3 ticks, 4 ticks, or 5 ticks. And anything lower than 2 or 1 ticks is probably something that you will avoid.
Yes.
So that is something that we hope to change the mindset of consumer. We know that it takes time, but over time, as the younger generation grows up to have the spending power, that's where they are more tech savvy, they better appreciate all the cybersecurity concern. And that's why also we have introduced education programs into the secondary school to educate them on cybersecurity. So as they mature and grow up and go into society, that is where they will be inclined to leverage on the label to make informed decisions.
Indeed, a learning journey for everybody in every aspect. We started talking about it, about the learning journey right at the beginning, right towards the end, we're still talking about a learning journey. It's really, really something that everyone is still trying to figure out and learn together. Now we have 5 minutes left. I do want to take some questions from people in the room and online. If you are asking us questions, please raise your hand, stand up, identify yourself, let us know who you are directing your questions to. I see questions coming in from the virtual platform. Who has the highest responsibility of securing IoT devices? Is it manufacturers, governments, or users?
Yes.
Doug?
I think the answer is yes. I think they all have to have it as a high level of responsibility. I mean, it's if you don't have all 3 of those sort of working together, then it breaks down. So I think that's, for me, it's a pretty easy answer. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you that. I think it's kind of like you don't want to have somebody who has a higher one versus the other one.
Yeah.
I think it's more like, look, we all have to be responsible for it. Otherwise, we might just create an environment that, oh, it's his fault or it's their fault. But really, I think collectively, we all have a shared responsibility.
Yep, and that goes back to the theme of this year's SICW, a shared responsibility.
Yes.
Oh, it's going to be difficult to tag who has the highest, but naturally, as we have all agreed, it's probably a collective responsibility that we all have a part to play. Cybersecurity is a team sport.
It is, and we keep hearing that throughout the entire of SICW. Well, there is a question here that is somewhat related to what Henry mentioned earlier about ISO 27444. How can we bring the world closer to a globalized standard for IoT security?
That is our vision. That is something that we hope to be able to achieve. As I probably repeated many times, the concern is really about fragmentation. It's really about having duplicated testing. And if every nation or every organization across different jurisdictions start introducing something that is not exactly that compatible, and that is where the potential issues eventually will surface. And that would then sort of disincentivize manufacturers who to want to come on board, because that it is always increased cost of compliance, that we have to always get our products tested again and again in different jurisdictions.
Yeah,
we know
it is
that
a pain point.
we may not reach there yet, but we hope that there is some in the direction that will eventually reach.
There is one question here about solutions to securing IoT security besides zero trust. What can a consumer do to protect themselves from vulnerable IoT devices? Perhaps maybe Richard.
Sorry, could you repeat that last bit again?
What can a consumer do to protect themselves from vulnerable IoT devices?
Oh,
I would
wow.
marry someone who works in technology at Microsoft is probably a good start. He'll take care of the house for you, as we've heard, so that's a good start.
Yes, thank
For
you.
those who don't have access to that, and a spouse or a father, what do they
That's
do?
family safety.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think again it comes back to also Henry pointed out. I think getting knowledgeable about this space is important. It's just something that it's going to be as much as part of our life. Like for example, oral hygiene, dental health, right? We teach our kids with that, and pretty much this is something that we will continue to have to educate, the next generation of business users or our kids on cybersecurity, cyber hygiene, and that extends to consumer devices as well. It doesn't mean that it's just what happens on the internet itself, but really everything that pretty much that we buy of anything online can be connected to the internet today. So you would imagine that there will be some form of education that's required. So I think it has to be a concerted effort just between even in the schools itself, just bringing that knowledge and the discussions into the schools also help with the kids to understand what they do online with social media, with devices that they buy, or devices that they're carrying and things like that. So I think when we have this kind of concerted effort, then everybody can level up their protections from vulnerable consumer devices itself. So I think that will be the most important thing.
Thank you, Richard. I mean, I would love to continue this conversation because these are always so thought-provoking, and they are conversations that we are always going to keep having, and to think about what questions to ask, what the answers might be, and to, of course, prevent ourselves from getting into the trouble that we can already predict will come from standards or labeling schemes that we maybe haven't thought out so well yet. But I see that we are at time, so it leaves me to thank my panelists, each and every one of you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Henry. And thank you to the audience, to CSA, and the wonderful technical people at the back who helped make this event happen. I, as your moderator, will conclude this panel by saying this. We all probably own one or use one connected IoT device in our daily lives, whether at home, whether at work, or commuting to work. And IoT has really just integrated itself so seamlessly into our lives that we barely notice it unless we pause to think about it. And it's precisely this level of integration into our daily lives that manufacturers like us must be committed to ensuring cybersecurity by design being baked into our products to ensure the security of our customers and to ensure the security of our shared cyberspace. But we cannot do this alone. We need closer industry-wide partnerships, public-private partnerships to really continue this conversation and to continuously raise the bar on cybersecurity. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all do more together. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to our moderator and our panelists for that very insightful discussion. Please do kindly remain on stage. We would like to invite you up front for a group photograph, please. Thank you very much once again to our panel. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of Raising the Bar, Building Consensus for consumer IoT device security. We hope you've enjoyed today's program. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Please do stay with us and feel free to browse the booths at the back of the studio by our CLS manufacturers and evaluation labs. Our next session, called Data Boosted International Collaboration for a Safer Internet, will begin at 4:45 p.m. We'll see you in a bit.